Robocalls. A nation mourns. You can feel the tension. You can cut it with a cliche. Smell the anxiety and the fear. It's like 1933 in Berlin. Will he win or will he... Oh, golly. I mean, honestly, OK, our very own Chris Sims is in Ottawa, and she has her finger on the pulse of the robot itself. Chris, what is happening?
Oh, Michael. You know, the graphic we came up with the Ottawa Sun of the RoboCop actually holding the phone was more interesting than pretty much this whole story.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, you know, we've done a lot of work on this. Mark Dunn has done a ton of work on this. So has Brian Lilly. And basically what we know is that something went on in Guelph during the last election, which was frankly won by a Liberal.
Yep.
So we know something went on there. That's what's really being investigated here. And if you want me to explain who this Pierre Putin guy is, we've been hearing about it in the news.
Yeah.
This is the deal. Okay, so this originating robocall, this thing that happened in the Guelph region during the last election, came from what they call a burner phone. Those are those cell phones you can buy that are temporary,
Yep.
and you pick them up at a store and you enter in a name. Well, the name apparently entered into this phone that originated this robocall was called Pierre Putin. Probably not a real person, right?
Nope. Yep.
So that's the person, you know, just saying, you know, going out on a limb, probably not a real guy. And you know, Johnny McChicken, as Brigitte called him. So that's the phone that originated with Rack 9, which was the, you know, the robocalling automated call service, which legitimately runs out of Edmonton, Alberta, which apparently sent all these misleading phone calls into the Guelph region. The story this week is that the originators of this story, the reporters that broke the news about Rack 9 being in Alberta and having some conservative accounts with them, apparently this Pierre Putin guy was supposed to give himself up to Elections Canada in the Guelph region, and that didn't happen. So to me, it sounds like just trying to keep a story alive at this point.
Oh, of course. Of course. Look, Guelph was won, frankly, by a Liberal called Frank, by more than 6,000 votes. It's a university town. It's going to be very hard for the Tory candidate, Marty Burke, who's a very good candidate, by the way, to win. What hasn't always been said, there's a bit of division there because there was a Tory candidate before Marty Burke, and he and his people may not be completely happy that he's no longer the candidate. And there could have been a few calls were made. There was certainly... We exposed this a week ago here on the Arena, and the Globe got it 4 days later. They're not too quick at this sort of thing. We know that the Liberals sponsored and paid for a call that went around saying that Marty Burke would stop women killing their unborn children if he ever came to power. We know there was dirty tricks played by them. The Liberals won anyway. If they really want a by-election in Guelph, let them have it. But we also know that the vast majority of the calls made to Elections Canada were organised by an American leftist company. This is simply not a story. And the guy behind it, he used to work for... I used to write a column for Frank magazine. He wrote for Frank magazine. We're meant to take these people seriously?
It all depends on your politics, I think, Michael,
Yeah.
as to whether or not and how closely you're reading something, to be perfectly blunt. And when the Globe and Mail ran that story, of course, it showed up in question period yesterday. And they're saying, ha-ha, this Liberal was phoning around saying that the other candidate, the Conservative candidate, was anti-abortion, was pro-life. It was apparently an anonymous woman's voice that wouldn't identify herself. Those are the same sort of things that the other side is calling American-style dirty tricks. It may not be telling them that their voting station has moved, but it's trying to push a vote in a different direction. That sort of stuff goes on all the time in elections, usually south of the border. But what's interesting, like you point out, is leadnow.ca is this massive website. The moment you go to it, it says click here to voice your opposition to what happened during the election 8 months ago. You're right. It's got direct ties with American companies that do the same sort of thing. So when you scratch down below the surface on this, it's hard to find some cold, hard facts other than Elections Canada is looking into what happened in Guelph. Other than that, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of fire here through the smoke. Yeah.
Well, as I said earlier in the top of the show, this is the tip of the ice cube, that there is nothing here. And it's actually quite embarrassing to be a Canadian right now, because this is not the president knowing that Cubans and former intelligence agents are going into the Democratic headquarters in Washington. This is such a digression, and we know it's the left who just hate the idea that they lost the election. And they had a protest in Toronto. organized in part by a guy who supports Iran, where there are no free elections, where the Holocaust is officially denied, where they hang gay people in public and torture and rape women to death. So, I don't know, who are the good guys in all this? It seems to me that we should move on to thinking about hockey rather than this absolute waste of bloody time.
You know, it happens on the Hill a lot, Michael, and I'm not picking on this one story. It happens all the time because of the press gallery, and there's many different people in it, but it's kind of like its own little, you know, ecosystem.
Yeah.
It's its own little, it's almost like the Truman Show. And once a story gets out there, it kind of stays banging around within the walls, and then we're the ones that send the stories out across Canada, and depending on your interests, those are the stories that are picked up, so that's why it stayed in the news, so to speak. But
Yeah.
I must tell you, what I find interesting is that the narrative that has been adopted. I was at this environmental defense meeting last night talking about the oil sands and the Northern Gateway, and a lady stood up afterwards during questions and said, well, according to all this robocall stuff, Harper doesn't have a Democratic mandate to do any of this. So, no, really, this has become part of the narrative. So that's what I think is most important to pay attention to here, is that it's now become kind of common knowledge or a part of the narrative from certain segments of society to say he's an illegitimate prime minister because of this story.
You know, an activist or two and his paid lawyer, or unpaid lawyer at this stage, are trying to get the mayor of Toronto deposed. They don't want Harper to be prime minister because they are the arrogance and the crypto-fascism of these people, the idea that they could lose an election to someone that they disapprove of is so irritating to them. Why can't they have real jobs and real lives and real families? Because they're not real people. Chris, as always, a great pleasure. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Michael.